On the 15th of April 2020, Magnus Carlsen and Alireza Firouzja played what I consider to be the greatest blitz match ever played. And as far as I'm aware, no one's ever covered all 16 games of that match on YouTube. So in this series, I'm analysing each game. This is game 2. If you want the full details and context of the match, I've linked that down in the description below, and also check out game 1 where I go over all of that information. So in game 1, Alireza won with the black pieces. He went 1 up in the match. So Magnus now had to try and strike back in game 2, but had the black pieces here. So Alireza kicked off with pawn to e4, and Magnus goes in for this Alekhine defence. Now he likes to dabble with this. So it's a hyper-modern opening. You give white the centre here, the knight gets kicked away, and pawn d4 comes. We now had pawn d6, striking at the centre, a typical idea in these hyper-modern openings. And now you can go pawn c4 here, set up that massive centre, but instead Alireza goes knight to f3. We had captures here, the knight recaptured, and now Magnus goes pawn g6. You can also go pawn c6 there, there's different ways to set up. Now we had bishop e2, again options for Alireza. He could have gone c4 or even bishop c4, but he's going for a slightly slow play approach here. We had bishop to g7, both players castled, and now Firouzja continues just slow playing the position. He can go c4 here, knight b6, and white has the centre, but black's going to try and undermine with pawn to c5 and get some piece play going. But Alireza instead goes pawn c3, and he allows Magnus c5 in 1. So the bishop came to f3 now, and the pawn captured here. And Magnus has already actually equalised the position. He's taken away this central space and his development is decent. So the queen now captured, you don't want to take with that pawn, leave yourself with the isolated queen's pawn, not an ideal structure. And even though you walk into this pin here, because there's no d pawn, you can't actually take advantage of that as black. So there were options here for Magnus. He could have gone pawn e6, but he went knight to c6 here. And once again, he correctly assessed that the position is fine after the captures here. So white could have taken this knight on d5, we know. Magnus left that knight hanging. But then black takes on e5, so you get the piece back. Say if the queens came off, well, black's doing absolutely fine here, actually better. So instead of taking the knight here, Firouzja took on c6, and this is what I mean about Magnus's judgment. So he says when he's streaming, okay, I've compromised my pawn structure now, I've split these pawns, but I'm going to get good piece activity to compensate for that, and he's absolutely correct. Now best here was moving this queen to c4 or a4 just to pressure this weakened pawn, but Firouzja, as is so classic of his style, switches over to the king side, goes for that attack against the king, and he wants bishop h6 and other attacking ideas, but the problem here is pawn to e5, which Magnus played in an instant. And now you're threatening to take these queens off the board. If you come back here, you're losing time. So Firouzja captures here. But after the rook recaptures, now black is doing absolutely fine. You can see there's more of a central presence there for Magnus and good development. So the knight came to a3 now. It wants to come to this c4 square, but it does it better via this route rather than d2, blocking this bishop. Now we had pawn to f5 from Magnus. He gets those pawns going. He wants to go e4 soon. And Firouzja now kicks back with bishop to g5, a tricky little move. So you can't block with the bishop, or after captures here, knight recaptures, then you're dropping this c6 pawn. That's the problem with the black position, this weakened structure. So instead, Magnus nudges the rook over to the e-file here. Firouzja brings his rook across, and although it might look like this bishop's getting trapped, it's something you have to watch for. Say you go e4 immediately, bishop e2, pawn f4, locking in this bishop, threatening h6, g5. Actually, white can wiggle out of this with bishop to c4. Because there's this pin here, the knight to the king, this pawn is now on prise. So say you break the pin with bishop e6, well, at the very least, you can just chop here and then take the pawn, different options. But the bishop's not getting trapped. So Magnus saw this, and instead of playing this move of pawn to e4 immediately, he played pawn h6, kicking this bishop away. And the players are just constantly calculating. You know, Magnus was straight away looking here, what happens if rook takes on d5? He recognises his weakened king and his unprotected rook. Classic signs of when there's tactics in the air. But actually black's okay here, because after captures, bishop takes with check. This is the line Magnus was calculating. Yes, you can pick up in the corner, but after this bishop retreats, you pick up on a2 here. You know, they're constantly looking at these deep lines. Anyway, Firouzja didn't take that rook on d5. He simply dropped his bishop back, and now bishop to a6 was played from Magnus. He pressures this rook, and he connects his own rooks here. So we had rook f to e1. Now the pawn came to e4. The bishop had to drop back. These ones came off, and now Magnus went king to f7. So we had knight c4 now from Firouzja. The rook came across to the d file, covering this key square. And now once again, great prophylaxis from Firouzja. He played this rook back to e1, just covering this one so it's not unprotected, lined up against this rook. There's so often tactics in the air when you have unprotected pieces. The rook now came to e6, again a prophylactic move. Magnus was thinking about knight a5, attacking this pawn, so he already starts to take care of that threat, and maybe he'll be doubling rook soon. And now Alireza was trying to figure out how to get this c1 bishop into the game. But before I show you what he played, if you're enjoying this video, do hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to never miss a video if you haven't done so already. So here Alireza played bishop to e3. Now he's coming into this c5 square, but Magnus actually had a good opportunity to snap that bishop off the board if he wanted to. It looks like you're blundering a rook because this one's unprotected behind, but actually then the knight can take on c4, and black's picked up two minor pieces for the rook. Black is dominating here. But what white would have played instead of taking this rook is knight takes on e3 here. And now black has a chance to take the d-file with this move, and is doing quite well. It's not winning by any means, but it's a decent position for black. Instead, Magnus missed the play like this. He played rook to d7 instead, still a decent move, but Firouzja gets this bishop c5 move in, an improvement of that piece as we can see. So Magnus considered going g5 here, expanding already on the king side, but instead he dropped this bishop back to f8, still a good move, trading off this active piece. And after we had this exchange here, we note that the king has now left the protection of this rook, and Alireza pounced, so he played pawn to f3 immediately, because now you can't capture or you lose your rook here. Instead, Magnus went king to e7, and now Alireza has this chance to take this pawn here, give Magnus the isolated one. But he didn't go for this. Instead, he decided to just bring his king in, do similar to Magnus, and Magnus now chops off. He doesn't want to give a second opportunity to give him the isolated one. And here there was an interesting idea of knight to e5. It's not to say this is winning or anything like that, but it was a very interesting move which Magnus looked at. Instead, Firouzja played more simply here. He just chopped this rook off the board, and after the king recaptured, he took on f3. And now Magnus said, okay, I just need to try and make a draw now. I don't think I have too much in this position. So he dropped back his knight. These rooks came off the board, and now we had king to e3 centralizing. And it's just a tiny bit uncomfortable for white here, for the key reason that black has the 3-on-2 here, but they're a bit more advanced down the board, as we can see, compared to white's 3-on-2 on the queen side. So we had pawn g5 now, pawn b4 from Alireza, king d5 hit the knight, and here Alireza makes a mistake. You can see the difference between the experience in the endgame technique between these two players. So best was king d3, for the very key reason that when the knight's on c4, it covers the jumps of the black knight, especially this e5 square. But what Firouzja played was knight a5, and Magnus pounces, so pawn f4 check. The king moved away, and now knight e5. Look at the transformation of the position. Look at the difference of the two minor pieces. So the knight came back to b3, desperately trying to get back into the game. Pawn g4 now from Magnus. The knight came to d4 here, And now Magnus had a couple of options. King to c4 was a good move. He went king to e4, equally a good move. And now great play from Alireza. He goes pawn to a4. He's under pressure in the centre on the king side. He has to try and get his own queenside pawns going. So pawn f3 check was now played. These ones captured here and the king came to f2. And Magnus said here, okay, I'm definitely a whole lot better now, probably winning. Now you might think that knight g4 check is just killing it here because after the king steps up, pawn f2, the king has to come back, king e3, but actually pawn h3 just kicks this knight away, and this one also covers this key e2 square from the king. Still not clear here, very tense and balanced game, black's still a bit better. So instead Magnus decides to invade with his king here. Instead of knight g4, he goes king to d3 in this position. Now Magnus has about a minute on the clock, by the way, at this point. Firouzja just 30 seconds. So okay, the pawn's attacked, but now an excellent move from Firouzja. He goes pawn to b5. And Magnus sits there and goes, wow, this is really annoying. Is he really going to escape on me? Because what he's realising is that this knight is now coming to c6. Threatening this one, threatening the a7 pawn. So we had a captures here, pawn recaptures, and now if Magnus takes on c3, then this is the knight c6 move, which is just drawing on the spot. You can't take here or the pawn will be too fast, so you'd have to move your knight away and then the king can take here. You'd have a line like this, quite similar to what we saw in the game. So instead of taking on c3, Magnus went king e4. We now had pawn to h3, covering this g4 square, which is quite critical. Now knight d3 check, the king came to g3, pawn f2, looks really scary, but the king just steps back, covers the square here. Now king d5 was played. You have to be a bit careful of these queenside pawns for white. Knight c6 came, king c5, we had captures on a7, and here the players realised this is heading towards a draw. So knight f4 check, we had these exchanges here, the king came to e3, knight g5, the knight came to c6 here, and the king captured on b5, and we just headed for this liquidation of the pawns. The players agreed to a draw. And here Magnus said, I was a bit too hasty trying to convert that game. He felt he let one slip away. But would it come back to bite him in the match? We'll soon see. Thanks very much for watching. If you want to see another epic chess game, click here. See you soon.